Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GMS magazine channel or podcast if you are listening to this interview in the podcast format. This is the RPG interview room. This is a production in which I am delighted to interview some really cool people from the role-playing game world. And trust me, some board gamers will also come in the not too distant future. I need your feedback though. I need to know if you really would like to keep seeing these interviews because I'm loving doing them. I love to post them here in the YouTube channel since I've already been doing this in the podcast format for since 2011. And I would like to know if you want to keep seeing this because I love to keep doing them. So if you do, I just need to increase the quality because you deserve a lot better. So please leave me a comment down there in the comment section of the YouTube channel or get in touch with me in Twitter or in Facebook or in Instagram or wherever you prefer. It doesn't matter as long as you talk to me. I will be ever so happy. In this episode, I have a returnee, somebody that I interviewed for the podcast a couple of months ago, Chris Dias from Chris Dias Ex Machina games, and we're going to talk about a pretty touchy subject. The conversation has been going on for a very long time now within the world of role-playing games about covering difficult, tough subject in the proper manner without having to be edgelordy or insensitive about it. And Chris claims to have a game, Amethyst, that does exactly that. So, knowing that he's a pretty thoughtful kind of human being and knowing that he's also a really thoroughly nice fellow, I just had to find out, and thus the interview ensued. So, it's about an hour long, give or take. Please do watch it. Let me know what you think, and I very much look forward to talking to you at the end of the video. Thank you very much for being there. Please remember to subscribe, and I will talk to you later. Chris, welcome back. It's been like 20 minutes since you were in the podcast, which means that you have beaten the record for the quickest returnee to the GMS Magazine RPG channel. How do you feel about that? That's quite an achievement.
I don't know where my trophy is.
It's in the post.
Okay.
Actually, I'm going to kickstart it. So I can get you a proper one. No. Anyway, we're going to talk very many things. We've been having a conversation, listeners, before we started recording, and Chris and I wanted to talk about how to deal with truly controversial subjects within role-playing games, because let's face it, role-playing games are very good as in the perfect platform for this kind of stuff. And you have been very careful, Chris, in the book that you have just kickstarted, but your next game, Amethyst, you told me that you're going to go full on for really amazingly controversial stuff. Tell me about it.
Well, like I said, as we've been talking about, like I said, we were talking about how this acknowledgement that certain storytelling, the way stories manifest, they can occur in different ways. So we look at something like Star Trek. Star Trek's been tackling controversial subjects in the guise of science fiction through television since the 60s. And whenever I talk about my love of Star Trek, I always remind people this is the reason why Star Trek is better than Star Wars, because Star Trek has been tackling these issues that are making all of the Star Wars fans go insane now, because Star Wars was like, no, Star Wars was always supposed to be white guys control the universe because that's what they did. And Star Trek has been like, we dealt with this back in the 60s. So when they have a black commander of Deep Space Nine, nobody cares. But you put a black stormtrooper and suddenly everyone loses their mind.
Yes.
And this is always said why I think Star Trek is better than Star Wars, because Star Trek has created scientists and engineers, and Star Wars has made directors and special effects people. But games got through this a few years ago. We were talking about Gamergate,
Mhm.
and we were talking about that role-playing games are going through, I think, a similar catharsis with the benefit of it not having a name for these kind of conservative voices to congregate and rally behind and have a screaming united voice. So they're coming from different fields.
Actually,
So,
you know that they tried to do that, right?
oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah. There was a few months ago. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think um, RPG Pundit and another two assholes decided that
Oh,
they want
yes.
they wanted to have the D&D gate or something similar, and it was taken by the community and turned into the most beautiful hashtag ever. It
Yeah.
was absolutely fantastic. So Wankers tried, and I'm not one for using profanity in the podcast, but when it's about talking about those assholes, I can't help
Yeah.
myself. They're just
I
motherfuckers.
I just saw I just saw the slight sliver of that controversy. I looked at it and I was just like, well, that's dumb.
Yeah.
Um, for me, what was interesting is that um, I think, see, so when a storyteller wants to make a message, right? We are seeing it with movies. We've been seeing it in movies since the 30s. We're seeing it with novels since the beginning of time, where they generate controversy by telling a story.
Mhm.
And the regular John Q person says, "Well, I can't make a statement like that. I'm not an author. I'm not a movie director. I'm not a television producer." And the great thing about role-playing games, it allows one person, a GM, to create his own story, create his own TV show with an interactive audience of between 3 and 6 people, sometimes more, sometimes less. And so I always think that a GM game session is a little tightly confined TV show or a movie that there is a director, the GM, getting to tell his story. The difference being, of course, is that the actors are improvising off of that and they're creating that story together.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that that story can be about nothing. You, as a GM can at any point, and he or she is entirely entitled to do so, to make his or her game about something.
Mhm.
Because a lot of people think, and this has been up until I would say 2000 and late 90s, uh, it was about you go into a dungeon, you hit creatures, and then gold comes out. And the first
Yes.
computer games were about that.
Mhm.
And we are looking at, and I had a big conversation about my with friends recently about games being art. And the idea of which games can be art, and the reason why we call it art is because it can be something other than a game while still being a game. We look at Limbo and Inside, we look at this War of Mine, and we look at these games that are about something other than just hitting something till gold comes out. And in role playing games has always been that, but it doesn't have to be. And then a GM can create a game that's about something else other than um, just hitting creatures with gold until hitting creatures until gold comes out. And for me, and this just goes back to my first Amethyst game when I ran it in 2002, when I first ran Amethyst. I had a player who's one of my best friends, and he was just like he was expecting a dungeon romp. He was expecting to level up his wizard, to kill creatures, and gold comes out. But I, being a storyteller, wanted to tell a story. Wanted to tell a story about the collision of magic and technology. And the setting grew organically for a year. So the end result was kind of different from where we started. We were retconning certain things as I wanted to bring in more elements to create it, to make a fully fleshed story. Because as you might have figured out, most fantasy game settings are kind of vapid, like they're
Yes.
hollow. There's not a lot of substance to them, which is the reason why when you take Warcraft and you make it as a film, it turns into dog shit because it's not a good setting. It's not believable or realistic. It's complete kind of it's kind of a farce. I like playing it, but
Mhm.
it's if you can live in that setting, if it actually exists tangibly, I think it's a good setting. I think Game of Thrones is a good setting,
Yes.
which is funny because as a result, it hasn't been they haven't been making very good games out of it because it's more of a flesh setting. So I find that kind of ironic. So back in 2003, when I ran my first Amethyst game, my friend was just like, I was kind of expecting dungeon ROMs. We would have one dungeon a year. So we would and everything else was just characters communicating, interacting, stories, betrayals, love, romance, and all of that. And as the story developed, and by the time we hit our first publication in 2008, the huge swaths of the story started to come into play. The collision of magic and technology, where magic disrupts technology. So you would have these walled cities that contained all of these vestiges of old man. And if you wanted to go to another city, you'd have to go through this hostile fantasy landscape, although it's technically only hostile to you, because obviously people out there can live just fine. They just have to give up their central heating, their cable TV, and their cell phone. And that became the first kind of message. And some people look at it purely mechanically by going, well, that's not mechanically balanced, this kind of thing. I go, yeah, but that's not how it is. So yeah, it's like people are like, well, how does technology counteract magic? I go, it doesn't. The only way to counteract magic is to push it away. You can't, there's no technology you can develop that will stop magic from disrupting your technology. So if you want to be a wizard, like the main character in the novelization of Amethyst, he has to give up his central heating, his cable TV, his cell phone, his refrigerator, and it's a permanent choice. But when I wrote the book, I was going through a crisis of faith at the same time. I was born into a Roman Catholic house. I became non-practicing, I became an agnostic, and now I'm an atheist. That transition happened while I was writing the book. So that transition is the character's arc as well, as he comes to terms with how would we as a society react if we discovered magic was real? Like, what happens if we discover Hogwarts was a real place? And people go, oh, cool. I go, no, you understand. That destroys the foundations of every religion on the planet. People would not be okay with that.
Nope.
So if you did that in a game setting or in any setting period, how does society deal with that? And the answer is not very well. So that was the first big thing I did. The second thing I played with was flipping the chaos law dynamic. So the evil forces that are trying to destroy the world are the forces of law. And the force of chaos is the force that creates life. Now, I'm not an anarchist. I actually believe in a balance of law and order kind of thing. But I enjoyed the idea because I started thinking about something really hard science-wise, and that was entropy. That as you increase chaos, you increase the disorder of the universe and you bring about the end of the universe. And if magic is akin to chaos, that means, because a lot of people think, well, magic is chaos, it's just crazy stuff happening. That means the more magic you introduce to the universe, the more you accelerate the end of the universe. And we are somewhat destructive people in general. And so I was making a comparison of magic with the fact that life is somewhat chaotic. Random things happen, things happening, and next thing you know, we get order out of that chaos, but we are still part of that machine. So the idea of making the forces of good being the force of chaos, the idea that magic creates dragons, they make beholders, they make all these creatures. And because magic is chaos, then life is chaos because magic creates life. So as a result, the forces of death, the forces that would be in opposition to life, would be the forces of low entropy. The idea, the fact that if you control everything is uniform, and that becomes the antithesis to chaos. But that suddenly turned that idea of hell as being uniformity and control. The irony of that whole thing was that if you endorse control and you endorse uniformity, you have stopped the arrow of time, and therefore you have halted the end of the universe. So the evil people in Amethyst are like, we are trying to save the universe from destruction. As you are using your magic and your spells, you're accelerating the destruction of the universe from your flagrant use of chaos. And that was a eureka moment when I was writing it, I was talking to a friend of mine. We were talking about like the fact that we wanted demons and devils, and we wanted these chaos creatures, and we were trying to meld that in with the setting. And I realized, like, wait a minute, why do we have to have chaos be evil? Why is that always the rule? And yes, it's the rule in 40K. It's the rule in so many movies. People always think chaos is hell, but is that a rule? Is that a commandment within this universe? Can't we just flip that around? And that was kind of one of those mind-blown moments, and it heavily affected how the setting was written. And that's just on the surface of just the broad strokes of the way Amethyst works. But then, of course, I'm like, well, if I'm doing that, I'm going to go for broke. Like, what happens? Like, and I started thinking logically how things happen. Well, if humanity, who wants to keep their technology, walls themselves in, then they would ally with themselves, which means they're not going to care if this person is an Asian or from Africa. These countries don't exist anymore, so we're all humans, so we're going to all stay humans. But these elf guys, those aren't humans, so we can enslave them, we can turn them into property, we can do what we want. And so I'm thinking, oh, that'd be cool. So it just being logical, yeah, we would probably use elves as a slave race. So that became an element in the story. And maybe they're elves from the classic literature, so they're free willing and they're free life and free choice. And I go, yeah, they're probably going to be pansexual. Absolutely, just make them pansexual. So because that's going to blow people's minds. And as I started writing all of these things, I realized, like, this is probably going to upset some people, and it has upset no one. And I only think that's because Amethyst hasn't reached beyond. I mean, I've got a couple gold sellers and a few other things, like the Amethyst 5th edition book is a gold seller, but it doesn't come close to Ultramodern, which is now Mithril and Drive-Thru. And so when I look at that and go, obviously I'm not pissing people enough. Like, because the very first negative review I've ever gotten was by somebody who claimed that he didn't like the book because humans were the villain, and they kind of are. But they'll call them humans were stooges, was his word. And he claimed that the setting had a creationist agenda, which was the most hilarious thing I've ever been accused of, because I'm an atheist, and that doesn't make any sense. And then somebody at Drive-Thru deleted the review, doesn't exist anymore. And the response was, obviously this guy did not read the book. Because there is nothing even close to a creationist agenda in Amethyst. So I started playing around with, I would see logically how the setting would evolve. And sometimes that setting would go in a direction that I knew was going to be controversial. And I go, do I pull back and rewrite the setting? I go, yeah, but at that point, you can see the gears of the creator adjusting his setting to make it not work. So I figured, you know what? No. So I wrote in that, well, how do elves and humans breed? Because technically they would be completely different species. And a friend of mine was just like, don't make them breed. Don't have half elves in the setting. And I was like, yeah, but I want half elves in the setting. So I needed to create a system to make it work. I go, okay, so I call it bonding. So when an elf and a human bond in this magical ritual, that human becomes magical. So suddenly he can't use technology anymore. And then they can have children, which means elves don't have children unless they want to, which means there would never be a half elf born in a relationship out of rape, which is how the main characters from Dragonlance, I do believe, I think Canis comes out. He's a half elf from a sexual assault. So I said, hey, that's an interesting. I made this rule for bonding. How does it work? I went, okay, if that works, then we won't have half elves being born for sexual assault, which I've seen in other stories. So great, I get to have something positive come out of this. So whenever we see a half-elf together, it's going to be an 11 family. Fantastic. And since I've already determined that elves are magical creatures, they'll be immune to disease. And I went, okay, if they're immune to human disease and they can't have children, well, they must be okay with prostitution. And I was just like, yeah, most likely they probably would. So I wrote that in the story. So yeah, they have absolutely no problems. They're free living, and they believe in all that, sure. And I thought, well, in that case, humans would probably enslave them as sex slaves. Okay, well, that turned dark suddenly. I didn't want this to go back to being dark. I was like, well, I did it. It's gonna happen. So I created this slave nation. At the time, I just placed it where I thought it was going to be, just in the region, because I said, okay, this is going to be Lim Shao. These are bastions. This is the Empire of Kanos. Where's the slaver nations going to be? Well, the only place I haven't claimed yet is the southern United States. So it's in, yeah. So unfortunately, it is Florida, South Carolina. It wasn't intentional. I think now I could have moved it somewhere else, but I'm like, well, that's where it goes. That's where it goes. So, and they enslave elves, and then they have sexual slavery and all that horrible stuff. And I was just like, okay, I guess that's how it is. That's how it is. Thankfully, I'm definitely presenting them as being evil and corrupt, and yet people haven't been in the 10 years after that book came out. People haven't been going after me for that, right? Going after the fact that, and the funny thing is that my illustrator, a guy named Nick Greenwood, who does all the illustrations for Ultramodern, he has done 99% of the illustrations for my book. He didn't do all the illustration for the first Amethyst. I had a couple of other people come in, and the cover was done by a couple of other people. One of them being Jamie Jones, who became a huge illustrator. So it's interesting that my first book has got 4 illustrations by one of the most renowned painters in modern history. Like, he worked for Wizards of the Coast, and now he works for Bungie. So he's like, if you play Magic the Gathering, you've got Jamie Jones artwork. You've got some of your cards. I actually have an elf deck, and half of the cards in my deck have his name on them. And this is the funny thing, Nick is Mormon.
Okay.
From North Carolina. So we've had a couple conversations. Are like, are you at all bothered by the subject matter? And Nick has been understanding. Like, there are definitely some very obvious political stances I give out. Like, I'm pretty left, so that's in the story, right? But he understands, and he actually appreciates what the setting's trying to do. It's trying to create that kind of dynamic. That still being said, within the first book, when he intentionally drew a character as being black, I was like, oh my God, he actually did that. Without asking. It's like, we should got to do that more often, because I never see a black character. I think, I can't remember if it was you or somebody else. It was a long time ago. It was Paizo. I remember what it was now. It was a Paizo publication, and everyone was talking about the fact that in this new Pathfinder book, they had a character, an illustration of a black person. And everyone's like, oh my God, finally Paizo has decided to let their artists create different skin tones. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I was doing multi-ethnic characters back in 2008. And I've also stated, of course, when I do white elves, when I tell Nick what these characters look like, I do use nationalities. I say dwarfs they're very much, the dwarfs in the setting and the Limshao elves are very much Asian. I say Middle Eastern for the high elves, and so forth. So we create these skin tones so they're not just white person, white person, white person. And then when we got to the evil elves, the drow, the drow parallel in Amethyst, I was like, let's not make them black, okay? So they became albinos, which in my opinion make a lot more sense if you're subterranean.
Agreed.
Yeah. So that became how the setting worked. Now, the other thing in Amethyst, and I'm ranting on along here, that came about was the fact that, well, if I'm setting Amethyst in a real world, how do I explain clerics? Because if I can't have Weejass or Palor, because every fantasy setting had a proof of God, a proof of gods. There was always, and why? Because we're all pulling ideas off of Tolkien, who was a devout Christian and basically rebranded Catholic mythology in Lord of the Rings. And that's just been the staple. We all kind of accepted it. And I said, well, if you're setting your game in the real world, how can you do that? And that's one thing, like J.K. Rowling is an atheist, and she has magic in Harry Potter. And I'm like, so there's no religion at Hogwarts, which I found was interesting because you never see religion at Hogwarts. And so she has magic without God, which is very much an antithesis to most fantasy games, which will create fictional gods. I was like, well, I can't create fictional gods without acknowledging the gods that we have. And the moment I say you could be a cleric of Allah and cast resurrection, I am then at that point acknowledging that religion as being true.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's really stupid. It's like the ending of Battlestar Galactica. You can't have a controversy about the conflict between polytheism and monotheism when you acknowledge one of them as being right. So I thought, okay, well, maybe clerics gain their power like a wizard, but they get this power from magic, and they claim that magic is beautified, when in fact you have wizards that are tapping that same resource without having a faith in God. So I said, great, we'll get away with that. So you can be a god from Chinese folk religion, you can be a Taoism, you could be a Buddhist cleric. And I said, sure, you can do that. But the unrelenting rule was the fact that God or gods had to remain unproven. And I had to do that because the moment I say, well, there's a Christian cleric turning on undead, and I'm sure every single Christian won't have a problem with it, I'm sure there's a person who's just like, wait a second, did you acknowledge Christian God as being factual in this setting? And being an atheist, I'm like, no. So that was the other big thing Amethyst had to do. And it was logical. It's like, I didn't want to prove that a god or gods existed. I wanted them to be a matter of faith, just like it is today. But to do that, you had to peel that proof of deity out of that setting. And that was a big one. And once again, Amethyst has been like this for 11 years. And at no point has anyone called on and saying that this is one of the only completely atheistic or non-secular role-playing games out there, because it even though it acknowledges these faces being real, because religion will never go away, it detaches that connection to that proof of faith. The fact that you can create a miracle without ever having to make a prayer. All you need to do is study a book and learn how to do it, which is kind of scientific. So the magic system in Amethyst is a scientific study of these rules of chaos, right? So suddenly a spellcaster is a person that is literally committing experiments and applying these experiments using this knowledge of a universe that's foreign to our universe.
But that's most magic in most fantasy settings, you know. I mean, science is characterized because if you repeat the same experiment under the same conditions in exactly the same way, you get exactly the same results. And most magic is that. I mean, you do exactly the same spell in the same way, and you always get the same result. You know, if you do a fireball spell, you always get a fireball because you've always done it in the same way. So I reckon in most fantasy settings, magic is a misnomer. I mean, it's another science. It's just made out of arcane forces, but it's science. You study it, you develop it, you perform it, and you always do it exactly the same way and get exactly the same results. What's magical about that, other than the force you used to create that effect?
Oh, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, I wasn't even saying that, well, this is an original concept. I'm like, no, like, this is just me going, we're all talking about it. It's always been this way. But the thing is, what I did is just like, yeah, but this is in the same setting with gods. So you have the scientific application of magic and the faith-based application of magic. And if I was creating a fantasy setting completely whole cloth, like it was in the world of Trogdor or wherever, you know, in the world of Krull, and that could work because I could just create a mythology. But because I was setting it on Earth and I made this rule, this was going to be set on the real world, even the main character, before he leaves his world of technology to embrace a world of magic, he had read fantasy books, he'd played Dungeons and Dragons, he'd played fantasy video games. Then he goes out of his city to go to a wizarding school, and he sucks at it because there's also no prophecies. If you don't have God, and you're dealing with a scientific universe, then there's no prophecy. There's free will, but there's no like it's your fate. You're chosen by the gods. Like, nope, there's none of that. There's no fate. There's no prophecy. There's no chosen by the gods. There's nothing. And that means if you're going out, yeah, you could get your butt kicked. And the main character of the novel, he's not a particularly good wizard. He gets his butt kicked a lot, and he kind of stumbles through most of the story. And every time I've done this game for Amethyst, because I ran the game, I ran 4 Amethyst campaigns over the course of 15 years. The first book that came out in 2010 takes up the first 6 months. And then the next Factions book, which came out in April of this year, that is the next 6 months. So there's a lot of content to go through. But at no point do we say that that we never define any faith as being correct. God remains unproven, and we play with, once again, controversial subjects. And I always invite, like, the opposite of that. One of the first illustrations I got was a Limshell Custodian, which is this female elf, and her armor was kind of opened, or was unbuttoned, and her midsection was exposed to the winds. And I was like, Nick, why is her shirt unbuttoned? Can you cover that up, because she's in a fight? And he's like, you're 100% right. I'm just too used to people asking me to reveal the female characters. I'm like, yeah, but that's unrealistic. I don't want any metallic breast cuffs.
Yeah.
I don't want. The only exception was the demons, because the female demons, they're called Shimzaza. They're more like the Asian demons, kind of the way anime portrays demons, where they're very human-like. They do that intentionally to seduce and beguile people. Then when that book went published, because when I went to 4th edition D&D, I signed on to the 4th edition GSO, long story, about 3 days after the release of that game systems license. Joseph Goodman from Goodman Games reaches out to me within 72 hours and says, hey, you signed on the GSL. We're doing that as well. I like Amethyst. Let's publish it. Not realizing at the time the arc that 4th edition would take, yes. And that a book that was supposed to come out in 2009 wouldn't come out until 2010, well after 4th edition had hit that lull and was going downhill. I thought we would have done a lot better if we had gotten the book out at the fall of 2008. Then, of course, the American economic system collapsed, which means no one had any money, so he wanted to wait until that whole subsided. By the time that happened, that was it. And we went our separate ways. But when we published, and this is going to be a humorous thing. So when we published the original Amethyst, my cover looked like this. So this is the core. This is my reboot. So this is the cover that we had designed. And when I rebooted the book in full color, this is what you got. You got the conflict of a whole bunch of guys shooting a bunch of orcs, and then this Tekken general on the cover. The back cover had these two guys fighting, and I had this image of this scantily clad female demon. Goodman was like, oh, I like that and all, but I like this better.
Oh my God.
He made us put the scantily clad woman on the front, and then the guy in the back.
Oh, Jesus.
So no one has ever gone after me about this, but I am incredibly embarrassed by the fact that this is our cover. And this is the only time you ever see this type of scantily clad people. So ever since then, we've been playing off of it. Even our new book, Factions, even though there's got a female who's got some definite cleavage, she's completely covered up head to toe, right? And then the cover on the back is the same thing, completely covered up head to toe. And that was something that happened, but that's a side effect of that industry where we have to attract pubescent men, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think it's people complain an awful lot when we say about, there is, an awful lot of sexism. And they're like, no, because we are not sexist, because we cannot be sexist, because we are the most open-minded hobby in the planet. And then you hear these kind of stories and you think, dude, you're being done. I mean, you're being played just like you play your games, and you're not even realizing how dumb is that.
How often are women decide to trade as trophies in your role-playing games, right?
Yeah, and the things that people try to legitimize that, no, it doesn't. They're not, it's just that's the way the character is. It's a bit, well, actually, that's the way the character is because somebody made it like that, not because the character had any spontaneous, or completely organic sprouting magically that way. Somebody designed and commissioned that character to be that way and put it there for a reason. Because as you pointed out, it's a massive difference between having that scantily clad demon kind of suggested but not necessarily completely revealed in the back cover,
Yeah.
You know, it makes a lot of sense to have it like that. You know, almost lie, um, kind of about to betray you sort of attitude, and having it and like, look, hey, look at my abs in the front cover of the book. It changes dynamics insanely. So the fact that people still deny that, it's absolutely baffling to me.
Yeah, and it comes out of a fragment of the way games are. A lot of games start with one guy and like five or six of his buddies coming down and they're playing games.
Mm,
But for me, it was a little different because my first up until I would say the early '90s, all my experience playing D&D, oddly enough, were always a bunch of white guys in a room playing Dungeons and Dragons. By that point, it was just dungeon rop. There was no plot. When we moved out of D&D and we started playing stuff like Cyberpunk and a bunch of others, and I started playing with the other. And I did a sci-fi game that ran for about a year, which is oddly enough, this sci-fi game is being introduced in Ultra Modern. So this almost 30-year-old game is now finding itself in Ultra Modern as a campaign setting. Um, had two women and three men, right? So we had a mix, and it became much more story based and a lot more character based as a consequence. The other weird irony about it is that there were only two names among us. The two women were named Courtney, and the three guys were named Chris. So anyway, but beyond that, that's how I ran. And when I ran my Amethyst campaign, very often we would have generally, I would try to get one or two women in the group. It didn't always work, didn't always take, but I would generally try to include some variety. One of my longest campaigns as a player, which is very rare for me, the GM came out as being trans a couple of years later. And it also, I won't say that explained the fact that there was so little D&D combat. It was much more story based. And it's because this person was wanting to express themselves in that fashion. And I think the most boring games out there is when you have 4 or 5 white guys in a dungeon hitting things with gold, hitting things till gold comes out. Because I'm not interested. I'm not interested in as a GM to tell that story. And I like having a mix of different players. Of course, unfortunately, I live in Prince George, which is the whitest town in Canada. Because it's a forestry town, right? And unfortunately, it's almost like Vancouver, where the ethnic groups are being pulled apart. Like in Vancouver, you know, all of the people from India are congregating in Surrey, and then all the Asians are going to Coquitlam or wherever it may be, and then you get this segregation. And it's not forced segregation; it's voluntarily segregation. And in Prince George, my hometown, it's not big enough for that, but you still see that. So I don't get a chance to play D&D with people of different ethnicities, and I think that would be incredibly. I would love to have a group that has that dynamic. I have numerous friends that are Sikh, and I made a point to getting the religions in Amethyst when I described all the human religions to make sure I did that stuff right, to make sure that I acknowledged these are the tenets of the religion, and with a disclaimer. Don't select one of these faiths unless you know what you're talking about.
Agreed.
And I would love to have a broad mix of different people in my group. But unfortunately, I always seem to end up with the same white guys.
It's very common that to happen. Very, very common. So, okay, one thing I'm getting from this is there is a way, or probably many ways, to do really hard, controversial topics in role-playing games and being edgy without being an asshole about it. Why do you think people get it wrong so many times? Because the number of times we're seeing games saying, "Oh, we just want to be edgy," and actually you're not being edgy, you're just being racist, or you're just being homophobic, or you're just being gratuitously violent for the sake of it, or gratuitously immoral for the sake of it. That's not being edgy, that's being an asshole. So how can these sort of issues be approached the right way in role-playing games?
I think it helps because I grew up watching Star Trek. Going back to what we were talking about Star Trek. I grew up watching the original series. I started watching The Next Generation. I loved Star Wars, but Star Wars was non-existent for 20 years.
A long time, yes.
And so I was a follower of Star Trek. And Star Trek did it by, this is cool. Look at this alien. We're going to have a space battle. Oh, and by the way, racism is wrong. Bet you didn't see that one coming, as we blinded you with the concept of science fiction. That's how Star Trek did it. It presented you with these fantastical ideas, space battles, Captain Kirk boning a green chick, and then, oh, by the way, did you not know that we were making a statement about war? Next Generation did that. And that's one thing. I mean, I love the new Star Trek, but outside of the sense of exploration, some of the really hard hitting points that they would hit, they've kind of lost sight on. And I think the reason why they lost sight on it was because they have to be really careful of that. Now they're doing it other ways. They're now including, they're not trying to discuss the subject by simply saying, yeah, this character is gay, this character is from a different race, this character is trans. We're not even going to acknowledge it. In fact, you may not even know this character is gay for 4 or 5 episodes, and it pops out and you're like, when was this guy gay? Like, he always was, but they're dealing with this space war. It was not part of the story. And for me, the whole point was, this is the conversation I was having with Joseph Goodman, because we were talking about the controversy, because I was dealing with this splitting of the dynamic of chaos and law, and then splitting God from the setting, and dealing with these really hard-edged topics. I mean, there's some things that are presented in Amethyst that are really dark that people still haven't found. It's still in there. It's in the pages. And no one ever comes up and be like, did you write this? I went, yeah, I wrote that. Like, you'd be the first person who's ever said anything about it. And to this day, 10 years later, people don't. But it's because Amethyst is like, hey, you want to shoot a dragon with a gun? Here's a setting where you have to shoot dragons with guns. But in order to prevent any really breakings of the rules, you can't be a wizard with a gun. So you can be a wizard casting spells, and you can be a guy with power armored gun. You can't be both, because if you want to do that, you can play War Machine. So that was the whole thing. And some people have played the game and stripped that rule out because they wanted to be a tiefling that could wield a gun. They just wanted my science rules. And then I present the book as being about that visceral. Mm-hmm. And then you grab the book and go, oh yeah, I can't wait to read about shooting dragons with guns. And then you read about it, and then there's 5 pages talking about religion. You're like, oh. I'm like, haha, gotcha. You thought it was about guns. Turns out I was making a point, and I snuck it in there. We weren't looking. And that's kind of how Star Trek did it. Star Trek made it about taking something, translating it into the sci-fi, and then changing a little bit. So on the surface, it seems like, that whole story, that famous episode where this one race is destroying this other race about their faces were black and white on the right side. And it's not until you watch that episode, you go, oh, I get it now. You look at the log line from that episode, there's no inkling that it's making a racist message. It's making an anti-racist message with that. But with role-playing games, just like with anything, if you want to get that message across, you wrap it in that fudge of tasty morsels, and then you move it through and you go, oh, that's what it's about. That's the reason why I think Black Panther is such a good movie. It's because it's a big Marvel superhero story. And it turns out the villain actually has a really decent point. And it turns out morally he's more right than the people he's fighting up against. But until you watch that movie and you get past the Marvel and the action and the fighting and the cool little scenes with Claw, and then about halfway through the film you realize, oh, that's deep. And you don't catch on that. That's why I think if you're a role-playing game designer and you want to broach certain controversial topics, I think, make it so it doesn't seem like it's that way from the beginning, right? Like, you look at Amethyst, and it deals with, which side will you choose? Which weapons will you wield? It doesn't say, oh, by the way, God isn't real. I don't say that in the back of the book. And some people have read it and went, I've had one guy just like, I love the book. I do not agree with you politically. And I go, that's fine. But he bought the book thinking, and he read the book and went, oh, this is done by a pretty hard leftist. I went, yeah, I'm pretty hard left. But that's how you do it. I think if you wanted to hit a controversial topic, that's the course. Is to be subtle. I mean, it seems like subtlety has gone out the window. You can make a point and be subtle about it.
But is it subtle good enough nowadays, though? Because I agree that subtlety has an edge to it. It's interesting, but usually subtlety. I mean, for instance, The Warm Within is a novel by Sarah Newton, who's a friend of mine and fantastic writer. And within her latest novel, there are some gay characters. And she doesn't really make that much of a point about it. She only mentions that he's gay because at some point she mentions how he's a widow to a man. You know, this character is a general, and the love of his life died and was a man, and that's it. It doesn't do anything else about bringing that character's sexual orientation to the fray. So for people like me, who's constantly looking for that sort of thing, because I'm interested in having myself, my tribe, my LGBTQI plus community included and represented, I look for that. But for people who are not into it, who are not interested, it may be something that just completely goes over their heads. How does that help anybody?
That's actually an interesting point, because that comes into the economics of a thing. So I'm writing a book, and I want to present some of these ideas, but I still want people on both sides of the camp to read the book, right? And that's why Harry Potter has a gay Dumbledore, but we never know for the entire history.
Well, we only know because
she says that in a tweet, and you're like,
really?
Why didn't that come up in the story?
Exactly.
And of course, she says like it's because there was never a situation for it to come up. Now, and that's exactly the point. And but then sometimes, I think that was an economical choice that she made, because she looked at it, or maybe the publisher maybe she had that scene written in, and the publisher's like, "Can you cut that part out?" Because we can.
It's a kids thing. Let's make sure that we don't get political.
Yeah, because what's on TV? What just hit on the air just recently? The Golden Compass series, right?
Yes.
The Golden Compass, which was made into a movie, I think pretty good movie back, I think almost 15 years ago. And when they translated it to the screen, they took the anti-religious message and they stripped it out, and they kept the story, but took that big. Now, Bill Pullman is an atheist. And when he wrote that story, he was absolutely making very obvious subtext about the evils of religion, because the magisterium is a religious group and they were constantly at war. And the magisterium was definitely a parallel of the Catholic Church. As a result, that series, although extremely successful in Europe, has not been really successful in America, because that message came out and now all these religious groups are basically banning that book, and then they protested the release of that movie and affected its sales, and for a variety of other reasons we didn't get a sequel. Now HBO, which doesn't give a crap about that sort of thing, and they like hitting those topics, they said, you know what, we want to do this, and we're doing it with the BBC, and you're dealing with a very agnostic society in Western Europe. But it's interesting the fact that religion is part of a culture, so as a result, people feel that they don't have to acknowledge it. Like I go to Italy, and there's religious iconography everywhere. And yet I never see people pray. And it's a statistical truth. The fact, I mean, of course, I'm Portuguese. The single most devout country in Europe is Portugal, because they pray all the time. And then you go to Italy, the seat of Catholicism, you're walking around, and everyone's going about their day. And I go into a church, and it's empty. I'm like, this is weird, where they've turned their religion into a tourist attraction. And then, of course, in Europe, and of course, in England, it's the same way. There's beautiful castles everywhere. And you walk in, and they've converted that this church into a tourist spot. And I'm seeing all these signs and stuff. I'm like, this is fascinating. But that's, so as a result, this novel got accepted in this area. And so when BBC and HBO got together, they said we're throwing all that anti-religious stuff in there because we invite that controversy, and that's exactly that point. So it comes to it's very much an economical decision for me, because a lot of people buy with their eyes. I knew that I was going to lose the fight on the original Foundations cover, but I could write whatever I wanted in the setting. Now, for me, I've actually noticed the fact in the novel, because I'm heterosexual, by default, I generally write with that in mind. So I have to, as a writer who's heterosexual, I have to actively go, all right, do I have to define their sexuality in my views? Can I start breaking that up? And there's certain things, like when I dealt with the Fae in the rulebook, I said they were all pansexual.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I say that in passing because role-playing games don't have a narrative. So I can't necessarily say, "Oh, did you know Mordenkainen is gay?" Right? There's like, how do you insert that into a D&D role-playing game without someone going, "Why is that there?" Right? Because you hear about Mordenkainen the spellcaster, but no one knows anything about Mordenkainen's life. So if you establish that he was gay, it doesn't make any sense. But with something like Amethyst, which has an established setting, I have all these story beats, so I can insert these elements of playing off of ethnicity, playing off of sexuality, and playing off of these concepts in the side stories throughout the whole thing. And when I write those, I go, well, I have these two lovers that form this castle and have this whole story, and I go just say, oh, you know what, make them two men just because I want to spice things up. But I have to actively do that because my mind kind of goes, oh, I'm a romantic by heart, so I always want to see a man and a woman get together. I have to actively make a decision and go, you know what, that's kind of boring. I got to spice these stories up, right? But it's difficult because I have to make that kind of active decision. But a role-playing game, just especially like D&D Player's Handbook, it's kind of difficult to do that. It's only when you get to the setting books or the adventures. I mean, it'd be interesting if you had an adventure where you went to the king or you went to the Lord and say, I'm giving you this adventure to rescue my lover. And the characters go through that whole story of rescuing this lover, the entire 30-page campaign, and they get at the end, and it's another guy. That would be fantastic, and I guarantee you, no one's done that.
True. I think, I mean, maybe because I'm gay, and thus, for me, it's such part of my life that there is no way that I can write anything that's not going to have gay characters within it. And recently, I was talking about the another author in Facebook, and he was asking, you know, I'm going to get my book out hopefully soon, and I want your advice. You know, should I mention that the characters should have any sexual orientation they want, or do I do it in a subtle way by including some LGBT characters or NPCs? Do I say it obviously? And after thinking about it for a couple of minutes, I thought, you know, just do both. You know, if you include, the problem I see with the subtle inclusion is that most people who are going to read those games, who are going to be straight people, they're not going to think about it, because straight people tend to think heteronormally. I don't think that's the word. You know, it's
heterally biased.
Yes, that's a good way to describe it. And that's just people. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's simply that's just the way it is, because we haven't been educated, or you haven't been educated. What about me? I'm gay. Educated to actually keep an eye on that generally. So there is. I always think. I said to this guy, think about the weakest link in the chain. You know, what's the lowest common denominator? That's the person that you have to write for if you want to reach as many people as possible. And the lowest common denominator, as in the thickest people out there, they need to see that paragraph in which you explain about sexuality within this game, because otherwise they're just not going to think about it. They just won't. Even if you give them some trans character or a lesbian innkeeper, they just won't think about it for the characters. point of view. So I don't know. Perhaps I am gaily biased, but I think that specificity, to be specific, it's an important thing, and to actually make a point about that is an important thing to do in games nowadays.
Well, the thing is that it kind of depends. I think, like what I stated, that all the Fae in Amethyst are pansexual, which means they basically, and so we've seen examples of them with same sex and even crossing that, where they would be, there's a whole thing about this Fae creature in a relationship with a Kodiak, and a Kodiak is a bear person. And so it's just like, and I have that mentioned, right? Because I felt it was important to acknowledge it, because sometimes people of different ethnicities and different sexualities, they need that validation by saying the author thought of that and he put that in that story. So it's like, oh, so there's precedent, right? Like in Star Trek, Star Trek dealt very much about racism, but they shied away from sexuality. And they shied away from sexuality all the way until you got to Deep Space Nine. Like throughout the entire original series, with the exception, and even through TNG, with the exception of that one little episode, and they were going to, and then they kind of chickened out at the end. And Crusher was supposed to kiss this girl who's got this Trill symbiote, and in the end she kisses her hand, and it's just like a cop out. But it wasn't until you got to Jadzia Dax and Deep Space Nine that they started finally kind of blunt that right at the front and deal with it on a level. And yeah, it was controversial, but at the time, no one went insane, because Star Trek fans were like, "This is Star Trek. This is what it's supposed to be about."
The only one thing that I'm slightly disagreeing with you here is that there were, in the original series, there were some episodes in which some men were wearing skirt uniforms.
Yeah, yeah. But once again, there's that subtlety. You're not sure why exactly.
I think Roddenberry probably thought, I want to do this, but if I do, that's going to be going a step too far. I think the fact that we're going to have the first interracial kiss in the history of American television, that's going to be enough. Let's not push the boat too much. Let's just have some men casually walking about wearing skirts, just as if this is perfectly normal thing to do, and let's leave it there. But there was a little hint of that in the original series, if I remember correctly, which I thought was incredible.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I don't spot things like that, but I remember now that you mentioned, that did happen, and that doesn't resonate to me, but to somebody else it can, and that's what I think is really important. Now, for me, when we get into the fiction of Amethyst, once again, like I said, I'm kind of hetero biased. So when I look at it going, well, Aiden is kind of a parallel of myself and a few other people who are friends of mine. It's kind of an amalgam of these people, and these people are all heterosexuals. And so Aiden's very much the idea of boy reads a book, wants to indulge in that romantic fantasy. And kind of like the way Mass Effect is, he believes that everybody is a potential romantic interest. Not only that, but in a playoff of that kind of Mass Effect parallel, any character's sexuality is up to flux depending on the characters, which I thought was very strange. But I appreciated when after I played Mass Effect 3, like, you could romance who? Really? You could romance? There were so many other options that I didn't even think of. But in the story, of course, as a result, it's by that kind of default where I assume that Aiden is heterosexual, and because there's a romantic triangle between him, this character named Raven, and this other character that pops up, that this is that default. Now, once again, I've established that Raven being Fae, she's pansexual, so she doesn't care. But in that same context, I'm looking at it going, well, how do I make a statement, right? And now there's this one character who's been introduced in book 1, is throughout all of book 2, and I've never defined this character's sexuality, because I can't think of a single point at any fragment of the story can it ever come up in conversation without it feeling forced. That Dumbledore moment, like, how do we have that conversation? And at no point I looked at it and said, and it came to the decision of like, okay, look, book 1 is Aiden's journey, which is a journey about belief, faith, and skepticism. It's so that's got to be the central storyline. And 2 deals with the shattering of those ideals, and like he comes to terms with his faith in the first book. He comes to terms with what he feels he's deserved. And the thing about Aiden is that I kind of played off of that incel type culture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I wrote the book, that term didn't exist, and I didn't even know that was a thing. But in this story, you have someone who thinks he's due this romantic interest. That he's in a narrative, he's in a book. It's almost like a Kingsman or Kick-Ass, where he's almost aware of the genre he's in, and this is my romantic interest. So when she shoots him down, I'm like, I am not interested in you in that way. He's like, wait, that's not how the book's supposed to go. I thought this is supposed to be my prize. And so he has to come to terms with that. So that became that arc. But this other character who gets introduced in book 1, who has a large role in book 2, this character goes through a huge personal crisis because, and this is something that was kind of unintentional, they live in a very regimented society where personal identity doesn't mean anything, right? Where you're a cog in a machine, right? Therefore, you're not meant to express yourself in a way that's different from the other cogs. You can't turn the other direction. So at the end of the second book, that person is forcibly detached from that society. And in the third book, we learn more about who this person gets to try to be. So I couldn't necessarily establish this person's sexuality in the first and second book because they were a proper cog. I had to peel them off of that cog to get them in a situation where suddenly they get to understand that they can run in any direction that they want, and maybe they want to be, a different type of part. But I couldn't create a situation in the first 2 books to establish their sexuality. I can do that now in the third book, right? But sometimes it creates a situation where, do I want the story to be a statement? Do I want to go, oh, by the way, this person's gay, or by the way, this person's non-religious, or do I want to build up to that point where a person, free of that shackles of society, gets to finally express themselves? And that's one of the things I want to establish in the third book. Now, how do I do that in a role-playing game? Well, the problem is you can't. You can't say, you can't really do that. So I can say like, oh yeah, Fae or pansexual or so forth. I mean, one thing you could do, you could create a race that their entire culture has stripped away the ideas of sexual identity. You could have an entire species that look at gender identity and gender assignment as being completely alien to them. That's fascinating. I think that'd be a challenge I'd like to take on in a later book by saying, oh, are these women or men? Or like, I don't understand what that means. That's a completely foreign concept to me, right? That goes in playing with Star Trek. Star Trek had that episode where Riker fell in love, as he often does, with that character who was a hermaphrodite, who was asexual, right? Of course, that character had to be played by an actress who was female, but that's part of how that happens, right?
That's coincidence.
Exactly, and that's kind of that ideology. But you could approach that in a fantasy setting by approaching that topic in the same way Star Trek does, by creating a race that they're split, and there's white and black on this side, and this one's black and white. And people go, that there's no difference. I go, of course there is. But that's a play off of that. So you could do that, and I could do that in a later book. Create a complete a species that doesn't have an opinion on gender identities in that fashion, and people will probably lose their shit over it.
Probably, I think so. But and I think I
they
reckon,
probably would lose their shit 10 years ago, though.
Probably.
I think if you did it now, you would generate more controversy because
people are thinking about it.
Yeah, people are thinking about it more.
Yes, I think. I mean, I think there is that one of the difficulties of that, and we should start to wrap it up because we've been at it for an hour now. This is, and I feel like we have just scratched the surface. I think one of the things about having a kind of non-conformist approach to gender and sexuality in role-playing games, which is, by the way, a completely different thing from having it into a novel. Because in a novel, you are creating everything. And I agree with you. I think that shoehorning it in the first or second book, it could have felt forced because there was no opportunity, not reason, because people say, oh no, there has to be a reason for people to be gay. Well, fuck that shit, for goodness sake. Jesus, that should stop. Stop now. I don't need a reason to exist. I just do.
Well, there'll be the same way as like, it's like, give me a reason why I'm heterosexual.
Exactly. It's ridiculous. I don't need a reason, but I need an opportunity. Exactly the same that a straight character needs an opportunity to say I'm straight by, mentioning lovers or flirting or whatever it is, which is very, very common. So it's the way that those stories are crafted. But in role-playing games, there isn't such thing because people create their own stories, their own dynamics within their own compasses, within their own biases.
That's exactly right. Every GM and every group of players is their own specific interpretation of your setting. I said there's somebody that he had a tiefling. Tieflings are an amethyst. But he said I have a tiefling who wields a weapon, wields a firearm, which is completely non-canon because I don't have tieflings and you can't wield a weapon if you're a magical creature. So I truly hope and expect that there are Amethyst games that are all run by white men that are heterosexual that just want to shoot dragons with guns. But I hope that there's a game somewhere where there are people playing against gender type, where people are playing and there are romantic options outside of just your regular black and white heterosexual lines. I'm hoping that by saying, yeah, elves are pansexual. We're saying, no, we're saying that it's okay. Explore these options. Take it, oddly though, someone says, I have tieflings in your Amethyst game. I'm like, well, that's not canon, but that's okay. And someone says, hey, I got a trans character in your Amethyst game. I'm thinking, good, thank God for that. That's exactly what I want to see happen. I want to see people exploring it in ways other than just the mechanical difference. I like a tiefling, or I want a dragonborn in your game. I'm more fascinated with people who use role-playing games as a way of manifesting elements of their personality that they may have issues trying to express. And going back to what I said about my friend who's trans now, he played female characters, and she now plays female characters, and she did that in order to express herself in that fashion. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think role-playing games it's a domain for everybody to express it, which is the reason why I always play old white guys.
Fair enough.
It's just what I do.
Well, I think we should wrap this up, asking people to actually tell us what kind of characters they're playing and which one of them are exploring different dynamics within Amethyst and any other role-playing game, and just being non-conformist about it in a positive manner. See what we get, because I reckon there must be somebody doing it.
Oh, I certainly hope. I can't say for certain. I know somebody is in a role-playing game somewhere, but whether or not my game has encouraged people, if there's one person that is, then I know that I'm on the right course. If I'm upsetting people for including that,
you are definitely in the right side.
Yeah, the right side. Yeah, exactly.
My friend, thank you very much indeed.
I told you we should have this conversation.
Yes, and actually we should have a much, much longer conversation because we've been at it for an hour and 6 minutes, and this feels like 20. And I'm only saying that we need to wrap it up because it's 20 past midnight and I'm about to fall asleep. Otherwise, I could be.
Well, Amethyst is going to get launched. Yeah, exactly. Amethyst is going to get relaunched to the Kickstarter next year, so we should talk about it then.
Absolutely yes. So, we'll talk to you soon anyway. I'll see you soon.
All right, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
And that is it. Thank you very much indeed if you've watched all the way here. Just truly appreciate it. Please let me know what you think. Your comments are very, very welcome, and I love to to be able to interact with you. Remember to subscribe if you haven't yet. And if you're listening to the podcast, please leave us some feedback in iTunes, because that helps an insane amount so people to find us. Otherwise, anything else, please take care of yourselves. Thank you once again for being there, and I will talk to you very, very soon. Take care.